The yacht was found drifting. On November 15, 1976, a commercial fishing vessel spotted something unusual 30 miles off the California coast. A sleek white sailboat, the Salty Dog, moving aimlessly through the gray Pacific waters. No distress signals, no response to radio calls, just silence. When the Coast Guard boarded the vessel, they found breakfast laid out on the table. Coffee in the mugs, still swaying with the motion of the waves. Navigation charts spread across the captain's desk, a pen resting in the margin as if someone had been interrupted mid-calculation. 2 life jackets hanging untouched in their designated spots. The engine was off, but the sails were partially raised, frozen in a position that made no nautical sense. Edward and Lillian Graves were gone. Their belongings remained. Wallets, identification, wedding rings placed neatly on the nightstand in the cabin below. The ship's log ended abruptly on November 12th with a routine entry about weather conditions and their position. 3 days of silence followed. 3 days where something happened that left no struggle, no blood, no signs of violence, just an absence so complete it seemed impossible. The Coast Guard would later call it one of the most perplexing maritime disappearances in California history. No bodies were ever recovered. No ransom demands were made. No credible sightings emerged. Edward and Lillian Graves simply ceased to exist, leaving behind a floating monument to a mystery that would haunt investigators for decades. But to understand what happened on that yacht, you have to go back. Back to where their story began, and to the decision that would lead them into the emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. If stories like this pull you into the unknown, make sure you're subscribed. Hit that like button, and let's descend into this mystery together. Edward Graves was a man who lived by routine. Born in 1932 in San Diego, he grew up watching naval destroyers slice through the harbor, dreaming of life at sea. But practicality won. By his 20s, he'd become an insurance adjuster. Precise, patient work that paid the bills, but fed no dreams. He met Lillian Hartnell at a church social in 1955. She was 20, working as a secretary, helping her widowed mother raise 3 siblings. When Edward asked her to dinner, she saw something rare, a man who meant what he said. They married in spring 1956. During their Carmel honeymoon, standing at the coastal bluffs, Edward made a promise. One day they would buy a sailboat and sail together. Life intervened. 3 children arrived quickly. Edward worked longer hours for a house in the suburbs. Lillian became the family anchor, managing the chaos of raising kids. The sailing dream became something Edward mentioned occasionally after a few beers, wistful, distant, seemingly impossible. But he never stopped studying nautical magazines, learning navigation, memorizing tide tables. Lillian noticed, but said nothing. She recognized the hunger in him. By the early 1970s, their children were grown. Michael joined the Navy. David finished college. Patricia married and moved to Oregon. The house echoed with absence. Edward and Lillian stood at an unfamiliar threshold. Freedom. In 1974, Edward walked into a San Diego marina and made a down payment on a 34-foot sloop. He named it the Salty Dog. He spent months restoring it, replacing rigging, refinishing the deck, installing navigation equipment. Lillian learned to cook in the tiny galley, mastering the art of bracing against the sway. They started with weekend trips, overnight anchorages, and quiet coves. Edward proved cautious but competent. Lillian discovered she loved the solitude of open water, the way the world contracted to just them and the rhythm of waves. Friends saw the transformation. They seemed lighter, unburdened. Patricia visited in summer 1975 and barely recognized her parents, tanned, laughing, alive in ways she'd never seen. By October 1976, they'd logged hundreds of hours on the Salty Dog, sailing from San Francisco to Ensenada. They knew their boat intimately. When Edward proposed a longer journey down the Baja coast, Lillian didn't hesitate. They departed San Diego on November 8th, 1976. Weather was favorable. Supplies were ample. They'd filed a float plan with the Coast Guard. Michael called the night before. Edward assured him they'd be careful. Patricia received a postcard. Finally, doing what we always dreamed. Love you, Mom and Dad. As the Salty Dog motored past the channel markers into open Pacific, neither could have known that only the boat would return. The first 3 days were perfect. Edward's ship's log, maintained with characteristic precision, documented excellent progress. November 8th, departed at 800, light winds, calm seas. They anchored near Coronado Islands, sharing wine and watching the sunset paint the Mexican coast copper and violet. November 9th, underway at dawn, 15-knot winds, ideal conditions. Dolphins played in their bow wake. They anchored south of Ensenada. The log entry was brief, 23 nautical miles today. Elle is sleeping well. This is what we worked for. November 10th, they remained at anchor, exploring by dinghy. Edward checked systems, inspected rigging. Lillian collected shells and wrote letters to their children. The log mentioned meeting another cruising couple from Seattle, pleasant people who recommended anchorages further south. November 11th, 30 miles down the coast. Edward noted a slight barometric pressure drop. Nothing alarming, just changing conditions. They anchored near Punta Banda. Lillian cooked spaghetti, while Edward tuned the radio to Mexican ballads from the 1940s. Then November 12th, the final entry, 0700 hours, underway, winds SSE 10 to 12 knots, seas 2 to 3 feet, barometer 29.91 and holding, position 3142 Len, 116.53 W, making for Bahia San Quintin, all systems normal, beautiful morning. The pen sat in the margin, as if Edward intended to return. He never did. Coast Guard analysis suggested the Salty Dog continued sailing at least another day. The mainsail was reefed, the jib furled but unsecured. Someone had been adjusting sails but hadn't finished. The yacht's position, when found, 60 miles northwest of the final log entry, indicated it had drifted in a wide circle for at least 48 hours. The breakfast presented its own puzzle. 2 bowls with oatmeal remnants, 2 mugs with cold coffee, spoons on napkins. A meal interrupted. But by what? No distress signal activated. Radio off. Engine key in the ignition, but not running. Below deck, everything was orderly. Clothing folded, toiletries organized, books on shelves, their wedding photo bolted to the bulkhead, and on the nightstand, their wedding rings, side by side. Lillian's had an inscription, always. The life jackets hung untouched. The life raft remained secured. Emergency kit unopened. The EERIE, emergency beacon, sat in its bracket, never activated. The dinghy was missing. Its tether had been cut cleanly with a knife. Someone had removed it deliberately. But why? Coast Guard interviews yielded nothing. The Seattle couple remembered them fondly. Experienced, nothing unusual. A fisherman recalled seeing a white sailboat on November 12th, heading south in good conditions. No distress. Weather records showed nothing extraordinary. No sudden storms. Conditions remained stable through November 14th. Mexican authorities searched coastlines. U.S. Coast Guard deployed aircraft and patrol boats, covering hundreds of square miles. Nothing. Edward and Lillian Graves had simply evaporated. In December, their children held a memorial service without bodies. Michael spoke about his father's quiet determination. Patricia read a poem their mother loved, voice breaking. David struggled to comprehend something incomprehensible. The Salty Dog was eventually sold. The new owner reported no mechanical issues, just a good boat with sad history. Theories emerged like barnacles on a hull, slowly at first, then accumulating in strange, distorted patterns. The official Coast Guard report, filed in January 1977, concluded with frustrating vagueness. The disappearance of Edward and Lillian Graves remains unexplained. No evidence of foul play, no mechanical failure, no environmental cause. Classification, missing at sea, presumed deceased. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug. But nature and investigators both abhor a vacuum, and in the absence of facts, speculation rushed in. The first theory was the simplest: accident. Perhaps one of them had fallen overboard. Lillian, say, while adjusting a sail. Edward, hearing her cries, had jumped in after her without grabbing a life jacket, driven by instinct rather than reason. It happened more often than people realized. Panic overrides training. Love overrides self-preservation. Once in the water, the salty dog would have drifted away faster than they could swim, leaving them to tread water until exhaustion or hypothermia claimed them. The Pacific shows no mercy, even to those who love it. But this theory had problems. Why would they have removed their wedding rings beforehand? Why cut the dinghy free? And if it was a simple man overboard situation, why was the breakfast laid out as if they'd been eating calmly moments before disaster struck? A darker theory circulated among those predisposed to suspicion: murder-suicide. Maybe Edward, facing some private crisis, debt, illness, depression, had convinced Lillian to join him in a final voyage with no intention of returning. The removed rings could be interpreted as a ceremonial gesture, a way of returning to the identity they'd had before marriage, before children, before the weight of life's obligations. The cut dinghy could have been preparation, a way to ensure no one could use it to survive. They'd had their final breakfast together, then walked to the stern and stepped off into eternity. But those who knew them rejected this immediately. Edward wasn't depressed. He was fulfilled, finally living the dream he'd deferred for decades. Lillian had written to her daughter just days before, full of excitement about their plans. Their finances were solid. Their health was good. There was no evidence of marital discord, no whispered arguments, no signs of the kind of desperation that leads people to the edge. Some speculated about pirates or drug smugglers. The waters off Baja, California in the 1970s weren't lawless, but they weren't exactly patrolled either. Perhaps the Graves had witnessed something they weren't supposed to see: a drug transfer, a smuggling operation. Perhaps they'd been taken aboard another vessel, questioned, eliminated. The cut dinghy could have been how their captors approached. The lack of struggle could be explained by the surprise and speed of the attack. But, again, problems. There was no evidence of another vessel, no damage to the salty dog, no signs of search or theft. Edward's wallet still contained cash. Lillian's jewelry was untouched. If pirates had boarded, they'd done so without taking anything or leaving any trace. And why would criminals be so careful? Then there were the more exotic theories, the kind that flourished in the dim corners of maritime forums and late-night conversations among sailors. Rogue waves, though the weather had been calm. Underwater seismic activity, though no earthquakes were recorded. Even UFOs made an appearance in one particularly breathless tabloid article, suggesting the Graves had been selected for study by extraterrestrial observers, attracted to the couple's unusual electromagnetic signature or some other pseudo-scientific nonsense. Dr. Malcolm Brenner, a maritime psychologist consulted by the Coast Guard, offered a different perspective. He'd studied cases of experienced sailors making inexplicable decisions under stress. The ocean is a sensory deprivation environment, he explained in a 1978 interview. Days of isolation, the constant motion, the lack of visual reference points, it can induce altered states of consciousness. Not hallucinations exactly, but a kind of dissociation. People in that state sometimes make choices that seem logical to them in the moment, but are actually divorced from reality. Could Edward and Lillian have experienced some shared psychological break? A folie à deux where they both perceived a threat or opportunity that didn't exist. Perhaps they'd become convinced they needed to abandon ship immediately, cutting the dinghy free in a panic, leaving behind their belongings in a rush that made sense only to their altered perceptions. It was possible, Brenner admitted, but rare. And it didn't explain the removed rings, the laid-out breakfast, the orderly state of the yacht. Patricia, their daughter, developed her own theory. one she shared only with her brothers. She believed her parents had decided something together, something they'd never discussed with anyone else. Maybe they'd discovered one of them was terminally ill. Maybe they'd made a pact years ago that when the time came, they'd choose to leave the world on their own terms, together, in the place they loved most. The rings on the nightstand weren't ominous. They were a message. We're together. We're at peace. Don't search for us. Michael was furious when she suggested it. They wouldn't do that to us, he insisted. They wouldn't make us live with that uncertainty, that guilt. But Patricia had seen something in her mother's eyes during that last visit, something she couldn't quite name. A kind of contentment, yes, but also a finality. As if Lillian was saying goodbye, not just for a sailing trip, but for something more permanent. David, the middle child, the practical one, refused to engage with theories at all. We'll never know, he said flatly. The ocean took them. That's all we can be certain of. Everything else is just us trying to make sense of something that has no sense. The years passed. The case grew cold. The occasional journalist would revisit the story on a slow news day, usually around the anniversary of the discovery. Books about maritime mysteries included a chapter on the Graves. Online forums debated the evidence with the same arguments cycling endlessly, reaching no consensus. In 1985, a body washed ashore near Turtle Bay, Mexico. For 3 agonizing weeks, Patricia believed it might be her mother. DNA testing was in its infancy, but dental records were conclusive. The remains belonged to a man from Guatemala who drowned in an unrelated fishing accident. In 1992, a salvage diver found a waterlogged dinghy matching the description of the one missing from the Salty Dog. It was caught in rocks 30 miles south of where the yacht had been discovered. Inside was a single item, a woman's sandal, size 7, Lillian size, but testing proved inconclusive. It might have been hers. It might not. These false leads, these fragments of possibility, were in some ways crueler than silence. Each one forced the Graves children to relive the loss, to hope for closure, only to be returned to uncertainty. What the official reports didn't emphasize, what got buried in the technical language and forensic details, was the human cost of an unresolved mystery. Michael Graves left the Navy in 1979. He told people it was for personal reasons, which was true but incomplete. The real reason was that he couldn't stand being at sea anymore. Every wave reminded him of the one that might have taken his father. Every horizon suggested the emptiness where his mother had vanished. He took a job at an aerospace company in Colorado, as far from the ocean as he could reasonably get. He married in 1981, had 2 children, built a comfortable suburban life that looked normal from the outside. But his wife learned early not to ask about his parents. The few times she'd pressed, Michael had shut down completely, retreating into a silence that lasted for days. His children knew they'd had grandparents who'd died in an accident, but nothing more. Michael never showed them photos. He'd packed away all the maritime memorabilia, the model ships, the nautical charts, and stored them in an attic he never entered. In 1987, Michael began experiencing panic attacks. They came without warning, at work, in the grocery store, during his son's baseball game. His heart would race, his vision would narrow, and he'd become convinced he was drowning. Therapy helped, somewhat. The psychologist diagnosed PTSD, which seemed absurd to Michael. He hadn't witnessed anything traumatic. His parents had simply vanished. But the psychologist explained that sometimes the absence of closure creates its own trauma, a wound that never scabs over. Patricia took a different path. She became almost obsessed with the case, spending hours in libraries researching similar disappearances, writing letters to Coast Guard officials, even hiring a private investigator in 1983 with money she didn't really have. The investigator found nothing new but charged her $3,000 for the effort. Her husband, Tom, was patient at first. He understood grief. He understood the need for answers. But by the mid-1980s, Patricia's focus on her parents' disappearance had eclipsed everything else. She'd wake in the middle of the night with new theories, shaking him awake to explain them. She'd spend weekends driving to marinas, interviewing old sailors who might have been in Mexican waters in November 1976. She joined a support group for families of missing persons and attended every meeting religiously. In 1989, Tom asked for a divorce. Not because he didn't love her, he said, but because he'd lost her to the ocean just as surely as her parents had been lost. Patricia didn't fight it. She moved into a small apartment in San Diego, within sight of the harbor where her parents had departed. Some nights, she'd walk to the water's edge and stare at the horizon, as if watching for a sail that would never appear. David handled it differently, which is to say, he didn't handle it at all. He threw himself into work, building a successful career in commercial real estate. He never talked about his parents. When colleagues asked about family, he'd mention his children, his siblings, but describe his parents only in the past tense with no elaboration. "They passed away," was his standard phrase, designed to discourage follow-up questions. But the silence took its toll. In 1994, David's wife found him in their garage at 2 a.m, drunk, staring at a framed photograph of Edward and Lillian taken aboard the Salty Dog in 1975. They were smiling, tanned, vibrant. David was weeping. "I'm angry at them," he admitted. "Is that terrible? I'm angry that they were careless, that they died in a way that left us with nothing. No bodies to bury, no real answers. Just this absence that never ends." His wife held him while he cried, perhaps the first time he'd truly allowed himself to grieve. The Graves siblings tried to maintain connection, but the disappearance had fractured something fundamental between them. They each had their own theory, their own way of coping, their own private relationship with the mystery. Family gatherings became increasingly strained, as if Edward and Lillian's ghosts attended every holiday dinner, occupying seats that remained achingly empty. In 1999, Michael, Patricia, and David met in San Diego for what they decided would be a final gathering at the marina. 23 years had passed since their parents vanished. They chartered a boat and sailed out to approximately where the Salty Dog had been found. It was a clear day, the ocean deceptively calm. They'd brought flowers and their parents' wedding photo, the same one that had been in the cabin. Patricia said a few words about love and loss. Michael read a verse from the Book of Psalms. David stood silent, tears streaming down his face. They scattered the flowers on the water and watched them drift apart, pulled by currents toward destinations unknown. It was meant to be closure, a way of finally saying goodbye. But as they motored back to shore, Patricia realized something that left her cold. They still didn't know what they were grieving. Were they mourning an accident? A choice? A crime? The ocean had kept its secret, and all they could do was cast flowers onto its surface and hope that somewhere, somehow, their parents were at peace. That night, they had dinner together, the first time all three had shared a meal in years. The conversation was stilted at first, but gradually warmed as they allowed themselves to remember Edward and Lillian as people, not mysteries. Michael told stories about learning to fish with his father. Patricia recalled her mother's terrible singing voice and how she'd sing anyway, completely unself-conscious. David admitted he'd been angry at them for years, but was trying to let it go. "Maybe that's all we can do," Patricia said quietly. "Let them go. Except that we'll never know." Michael nodded. David said nothing, but something in his face had softened. They made a promise that night. They'd stop searching. They'd stop theorizing. They'd focus instead on remembering the 20 years they'd had with their parents rather than the mystery of how those parents had left the world. It was a reasonable promise. A healthy promise. Patricia lasted 3 months before she was back in the library, searching through maritime records, convinced she'd overlooked something crucial. In 2008, something unexpected happened. A documentary filmmaker named Rachel Solis was researching maritime mysteries for a series she was developing. She'd come across the Graves case and found herself unable to let it go. Something about the meticulously maintained ship's log, the laid-out breakfast, the removed wedding rings. It felt like a story with clues that pointed to something just beyond perception. Solis obtained permission to review the original Coast Guard files, some of which had been digitized in the early 2000s. She spent months going through evidence photos, witness statements, and investigative notes. And then she found something the original investigators had documented but never emphasized: a weather anomaly. On November 13th, 1976, the day after Edward's final log entry, there had been what meteorologists call a microburst. It was a highly localized weather event, lasting only a few hours, characterized by sudden and severe downward winds. These events were poorly understood in the 1970s and rarely detected by standard weather stations. But satellite data, reviewed decades later with more sophisticated analysis tools, showed clear evidence of a microburst occurring in the exact region where the Salty Dog would have been sailing. A microburst at sea can be catastrophic. Winds can exceed 80 miles per hour with no warning. The sea surface becomes chaotic. Visibility drops to near zero, and then, just as suddenly, it's over. Clear skies, calm waters, no trace of the violence that just occurred. Solis contacted a maritime engineer to model what might have happened. The scenario went like this. Edward and Lillian are below deck, perhaps eating breakfast or reviewing charts. The microburst hits without warning. The yacht is knocked violently, perhaps even capsized temporarily. Loose items, including breakfast dishes, are thrown around but land back on the table once the boat rights itself. The sudden motion could have thrown one or both of them, causing injury or unconsciousness. In a dazed state, potentially dealing with hypothermia or head trauma, they might have made the decision to abandon ship. Perhaps they believed the yacht was sinking, even though it wasn't. They cut the dinghy loose, planning to get in, but the ocean was too violent. The dinghy was swept away. They were left on the yacht, injured, disoriented. The wedding rings? Lillian might have removed them due to swelling from an injury. Edward might have done the same in solidarity, or because his hands were so cold he feared losing his ring to the sea. They'd placed them carefully on the nightstand, intending to put them back on once they'd recovered. But they never recovered. Their injuries were too severe, or hypothermia had already progressed too far. They'd gone to the deck, perhaps hoping to signal for help, and there, weakened and confused, they'd fallen overboard. Not together in some romantic gesture, but separately, tragically, unable to help each other. The yacht, its automatic systems damaged by the microburst, had continued drifting. The partially raised sails were the result of Edward's final attempt to control the vessel before losing consciousness. The breakfast on the table was exactly what it appeared to be, a meal interrupted by sudden catastrophe. It was a theory that fit almost all the facts. It was scientifically plausible. It removed the need for elaborate conspiracies or psychological breaks or supernatural explanations. Solis presented her findings in a 2009 documentary titled Lost at Sea, The Graves Mystery. The film was well received, praised for its thorough research and sensitive treatment of the family. Patricia, Michael, and David were interviewed. They each expressed cautious appreciation for Solis's work, though their responses varied. Michael found it comforting. It makes them victims of nature, not of their own choices or someone's malice. I can live with that. Patricia remained skeptical. It's neat. Maybe too neat. Life doesn't usually resolve itself so cleanly. David said simply, "It's one more theory. Maybe it's right. Maybe it isn't. I've made peace with not knowing." But the microburst theory had an unintended effect. It reignited public interest in the case. Online forums exploded with debates. Amateur meteorologists weighed in. Sailors shared their own experiences with sudden weather events. The Graves case became something of a cause célèbre among a certain subset of maritime enthusiasts. In 2011, a retired Coast Guard investigator named Thomas Chen published a lengthy rebuttal to Solis's theory in a maritime safety journal. He pointed out several inconsistencies. The microburst, while real, would have likely damaged the rigging more severely. The neat placement of the rings didn't fit with a chaotic emergency. And most significantly, if Edward and Lillian were experienced enough to handle the conditions they'd been sailing in, they would have known not to abandon a perfectly sound vessel. The cardinal rule of maritime survival is stay with the ship. Chen's analysis concluded, the microburst may have been a factor, but it doesn't explain the totality of the evidence. This case remains, in my professional opinion, genuinely anomalous. And so the mystery persisted, refusing easy resolution. In 2015, Michael Graves passed away from a sudden heart attack at age 60. At his funeral, his widow revealed something he'd never told anyone. Every November 15th, the anniversary of the day the Salty Dog was found drifting, Michael had driven to the coast and spent the day alone, staring at the ocean. He'd never mentioned this ritual to anyone. It was his private remembrance, his silent vigil for the parents who'd vanished into blue emptiness. Patricia found some measure of peace in her later years. She remarried in 2016 to a man who'd also lost family to the sea. His son, a commercial fisherman, had drowned in 2003. They understood each other's specific type of grief, the way it never quite left, but learned to coexist with daily life. She still visited the marina occasionally, but no longer with the desperate, searching energy of her younger years. Now it was simply remembrance. David, true to form, channeled his experience into something practical. In 2018, he established a foundation to support families of missing persons, particularly those lost at sea. He funded Coast Guard search operations, provided financial assistance to families dealing with extended searches, and advocated for better maritime safety regulations. It was his way of transforming private grief into public good. The three siblings, now two after Michael's death, realized something over the years. Their parents' disappearance had defined them, shaped their lives in profound ways, but it didn't have to destroy them. The mystery would never be solved, but life could still be lived. Love could still be found. Meaning could still be made, even in the shadow of permanent uncertainty. The Salty Dog was sold twice more. The third owner, marine biologist Dr. Kenneth Ashworth, bought it in 2019, drawn by solid construction and the story attached. During restoration, Ashworth found something no one had noticed before. Behind a cabin panel, wedged between hull and interior finish, was a small waterproof pouch. Inside, a letter in Lillian's handwriting, dated November 10th, 1976. The letter was addressed to their children. Ashworth contacted Patricia and David immediately. They met at his dock on a gray afternoon in December 2019. He handed them the pouch, sensing this moment belonged to them alone. Patricia opened it. David stood beside her, hand on her shoulder. The letter was 3 pages. Lillian wrote about the beauty of their journey, the joy of living without schedules, the profound peace she and Edward had found on the water. She wrote about pride in their children, worry they hadn't been adventurous enough as parents. Then, the final paragraph. We've decided that when our time comes, not today or tomorrow, but someday when we're ready, we want this to be where we stay. Not in a cemetery with headstones and scheduled visiting hours, but here in the vastness, surrounded by beauty. Edward jokes will become part of the currents, traveling the world together forever. Maybe he's right. If you're reading this, something has happened. Don't be sad. We lived fully, loved completely, and this water that might seem like an ending to you feels like continuation to us. Remember us on the water, happy. Remember us together, always, Mom. Patricia read it twice, 3 times. David stood very still. They knew, Patricia whispered. They'd made peace with the idea. David shook his head. Or she was just being poetic, planning for eventual future, not that specific moment. But those words, "If you're reading this, something has happened," weren't theoretical. They were intentional. The siblings would debate this forever. Premeditation or musings on mortality. Had Edward and Lillian chosen their exit, or had fate chosen for them? Ashworth quietly excused himself, leaving them alone with their mother's words. "I don't know if this makes it better or worse," David finally said. Patricia folded the letter. "Maybe it doesn't have to be either. Maybe it just is." They kept the letter private, sharing only with Michael's widow and their families. Documentarians and investigators could continue debating. But this, their mother's final message, belonged to them alone. In following years, both found they could think about their parents differently. The anguish of imagining terror diminished. In its place, recognition that Edward and Lillian had been autonomous people who'd made their own choices, lived their values, and perhaps found exactly what they sought. The ocean had taken them, but maybe they'd also given themselves to it. On November 15th, 2024, 48 years after the salty dog was found drifting, Patricia made one final trip. She was 72, dark curls, long since gray. David had passed the previous year. She was the last Graves child remaining. She brought flowers and a copy of her mother's letter, which she read aloud to the empty horizon. When she finished, she didn't cry. She smiled, small, sad, accepting. "I get it now," she said to wind and waves. "You wanted to be free. You wanted to choose. And you did." She scattered flowers, watching them drift and disappear, claimed by currents carrying them to unknown destinations. Then she walked back to her car and drove home without looking back. The true fate of Edward and Lillian Graves remains unknown. No bodies recovered. No definitive evidence. Theories continue. Microburst, accident, choice, fate, each plausible, none conclusive. But perhaps the real mystery isn't what happened in those final hours. Perhaps it's something deeper. How much control do we have over our endings? And if we could choose, would we want neat explanation or profound ambiguity of becoming part of something larger? Edward and Lillian Graves sailed into the Pacific in November 1976. They never returned. But somewhere in that vastness, in currents circling the globe, in waves rising without witness, there's a story belonging only to them. The ocean keeps its secrets, and some secrets are meant to be kept. The couple who vanished didn't leave answers. They left something more valuable, a reminder that not every mystery demands solution, that some disappearances aren't tragedies but transformations, and that love sometimes expresses itself in ways others can never fully understand. The salty dog still sails today under Dr. Ashworth's stewardship. He rechristened it Continuation, inspired by Lillian's letter. On quiet nights when wind dies and ocean mirrors stars, Ashworth sometimes feels something. Not a ghost, but a presence. Contentment. Completion. Two people who found what they sought. He never mentions this. Some things are too fragile for words. Edward and Lillian Graves left no final answers. They left an invitation to look at vast unknown and see not terror, but possibility. To understand mystery isn't always something to solve, but sometimes something to honor. They departed seeking adventure in life's final chapters. What they found, by choice, chance, or combination, was complete freedom. The freedom to disappear into something beautiful and never be fully understood. Perhaps that's not tragedy at all. Perhaps it's exactly what they wanted. Always.